In April 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic was at its peak, Daniel Carter, a high school senior, was living with his mother's parents in the U.S. while his parents remained behind in Canada. Schools were shutting down and the virus was spreading fast, so they decided to leave the city to protect their grandparents from exposure. They moved to a remote island in the Mississippi River. It was isolated, surrounded by miles of open water. The island itself was shaped like a crescent, with the northern end being older and more stable. That's where they moved. A small community of about 50 people lived a few miles away, mostly on boats, since much of the island flooded during the rainy season. The land was covered in tall grass, scattered bushes, and a few clumps of bamboo. 5 palm trees stood along the riverbank, barely moving in the humid air. The southern end of the island was newly formed, a strip of white sand that had appeared only a year ago. Nobody lived there. Their new home was a single-story tin house on tall wooden stilts. It needed a lot of repairs, but the layout was decent. 3 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a shared dining area. Daniel took the east room, while his grandparents occupied the southern bedroom with an attached bathroom. They hired workers to paint the walls and bought a small generator for power. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Daniel's grandfather had suffered a stroke in 2018, which left the left side of his body weak. He could still take care of himself and walk, but he needed help getting dressed and someone to support him when he went outside. His grandmother had her issues. Her feet would swell painfully if she stood for too long. In order to help out around the house, they brought in a housekeeper. Her name was Emily, a local woman in her mid-20s. Her husband had left for the city and eventually stopped answering her calls. She had no schooling past 5th grade and needed the job to support herself. But whatever was in that house seemed to focus on her the most. While Daniel and his grandparents had their share of strange experiences, what Emily went through was far worse. It was aggressive, intrusive, and never-ending. She told Daniel about it since they were close in age and got along well with his grandparents. But she insisted that he not say anything to anyone. He honored that request, and to this day he only discusses the things that happened to him personally. The first strange thing happened the night they moved in. Daniel's grandparents were already in bed, and the housekeeper had not yet arrived. He was lying awake, unable to sleep in the new house, when he heard something. A thud, thud, thud coming from under the floor. A few weeks later, by mid-May, their housekeeper Emily had arrived. One evening, sometime around 11 p.m., Daniel was working at his desk doing homework while his grandparents slept. That's when he saw it. A dark figure is standing in the dining area. At first, his brain tried to make sense of it. Was it Emily? But that didn't make sense. This thing was huge, almost touching the ceiling and as wide as the doorway. Emily was barely 5 feet tall and very thin. His stomach dropped. When he looked back, the figure moved. Fast. It rushed toward the window, knocking over a chair in the process. The window had bars. Whatever this was, it couldn't have simply gotten out. His heart pounding, Daniel sprinted into the dining room and flipped on the light. Nothing. The chair lay on its side, but the room was empty. Emily came out of her room, rubbing her eyes. "What was that?" Daniel hesitated. He didn't want to scare her on her first night. "I accidentally knocked the chair over," he lied. Even now, he regrets saying that. Then things got worse. Daniel started catching glimpses of dark shapes darting just out of sight. He'd hear whispers outside, low voices speaking a language he didn't recognize. Every night, something whispered his name from the shadows outside the house. When he tried to sleep or study, something would lightly brush against his skin, just enough to send chills down his spine. And every now and then, their generator would suddenly stop working. Maybe it was just a mechanical issue. Or maybe not. The entity in the house never broke anything, but it tormented Emily in eerie ways. She heard voices mocking her, whispering insults in her ear. If she left food alone for just 5 minutes, it would be crawling with ants, though the rest of the house saw none. Occasionally, she felt sharp pokes on her skin, only to discover red marks, as if she had been scratching. though she hadn't. One evening, her door suddenly slammed shut from the outside. After that, she avoided sleeping in her room and wandered the house at night instead. She couldn't leave. She had nowhere to go. Daniel's grandparents were not affected. His grandmother believed their religion kept them safe. It rained heavily in July during the rainy season, flooding the island and surrounding the house with water. His grandparents purchased a motorboat, but Daniel is the only one that used it. Emily stayed inside, refusing to go out. One night at about 6 p.m., Daniel was bringing in groceries and generator fuel by motorboat when some vegetables spilled into the water. As he leaned forward to pick them up, he heard a splash. Something had climbed on the boat. Fear gripped him. Slowly, he turned his head a little, and out of the corner of his eye, glimpsed a dark shape sitting at the other end of the boat, 12 feet away. It did not move, but he could feel it watching him. Keeping his gaze away from the figure, he reached for the motor and started the boat. The figure didn't disappear. He steered carefully toward the house, keeping his eyes down. As soon as they reached dry land, he leaped into the water and rushed up the stairs. By the time he finally looked back, it was gone. That night, something pounded on his window, which should have been impossible since it was 6 feet above the water. One evening in September 2020, around midnight, Daniel noticed that Emily's door was ajar. He went to check, but she was not there. Searching the rest of the house, he found the front door open. Outside, there was a flattened path in the grass leading away from the house as if something huge had pushed through. Emily was too small to have made that. He followed the trail and found himself on the new, sandy section of the island 200 yards away. There, he spotted Emily walking aimlessly across the white sand. Sleepwalking. He ran to her, shaking her awake. She woke up crying, saying she would never return to the house. Still, wearing only her night clothes, she had no choice but to go back. That evening, she slept on the floor in Daniel's room but returned to her own before sunrise. The next morning, she went back to her chores as if nothing had happened. After that night, things only got worse for Emily. She changed her routine, trying to avoid whatever was haunting her. She refused to bathe in the house, choosing to wash in the river instead. She ate her food immediately after cooking, afraid to leave it unattended. But nothing worked. Whatever she did, the presence was still there. The moment night fell, it found her. It didn't matter where she went. There was no escape. Daniel's grandmother prayed non-stop. She felt that their faith protected her and Daniel's grandfather, and maybe she was right. Nothing ever happened to them. Sometimes the prayers even seemed to quiet things down for Daniel. But Emily? It was as if the presence ignored those prayers when it came to her. At one point, it seemed like she was no longer staying for safety or money. She stayed out of pure stubbornness, as if she refused to let whatever haunted the house win. Then in April 2021, she received news about her husband. She gathered her belongings and left. The house changed afterward. The air still felt heavy, but the worst was over. Daniel still saw shadows move in the corner of his vision. Occasionally, he'd feel a sudden touch on his arm when he was sitting at the table, even though no one was there. Once, he heard a massive crash and rushed to check on his grandparents, thinking one of them had fallen, only to find everything intact.